From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week, we're going to discuss the White House's new arms sales policy, which was released last week. With the Middle East historically being a major destination for U.S. weapons, it's important for us to look into this new arms sales policy and see what impact it might have on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy towards the region. This new plan, which President Trump called, quote, Buy American, not surprisingly, is born out of his desire to sell more American weapons as a means to boost the U.S. economy and create more jobs at home. That was a goal he articulated during his presidential campaign. With us to provide expert perspectives on this issue are Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Michael, thanks for being here.
Nice to be here, Paul.
And our very own Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute and Director of the Defense and Security Program. Bilal, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Michael, let me start with you. Since this is obviously not the first arms sales policy the U.S. government has formulated, tell us if there's anything new about it. What does it intend to achieve that might be different from the goals of, say, President Obama's policy of 2014?
Well, a couple of things, Paul. One, I would say that any arms sale policy is like a national security strategy or a national defense strategy, more of a theoretical construct, which may or may not tell you much about what really happens. Mm-hmm. So that's point number one to bear in mind. Point number two, having said that, however, is that it does endeavor to simplify and to expedite and to facilitate arms sales, to make them faster, to make fewer technologies of the utmost sensitivity so that other things can be sold more quickly. And therefore, I think it's consistent with the Trumpian view of, trying to do better business and strengthen America's exports. So that would be a second point. But a third point is in regard to the Middle East, I tend to think that this is the part of the world where historically we've been the most troubled in how we think about arms sales. And there are people on the left who say that arms sales in general are bad. I'm not in that category. I think in NATO and in East Asia, they often are very good ways to strengthen important alliances and improve interoperability and help countries that are responsible market, democracies better protect themselves in difficult neighborhoods. In the Middle East, there's an element of cynicism about American arms sales and a recycling of petrodollar kind of concept that's been around for decades. And I'm not always a big fan of the sales we make because even though if the Saudis are going to spend a lot of money on something, they might as well buy it from us, I also don't always want to contribute to what sometimes feels like a waste of money, even if it's their money, not ours.
Well, before getting too far further, how would you summarize for our audience, the main points of this new arms policy?
I think, I'll let Bilal go into more detail. He may be studying it in greater detail, but to me, what jumps out is the effort at simplification and at promotion of arms sales, but in an environment we were already doing pretty well in, because Middle Eastern countries, regardless of how much red tape we impose, they want to have a certain fraction of their arms sales with us because we're the ultimate guarantor of their security and we have the ultimate interoperability with their systems. And so they would never go too far against us in most cases, but they also want to hedge their bets. So when you think of things in those terms, a promotion of simplification, speed, and ease of access might move the needle 5 or 10%. I don't think that it's going to move the needle 20 or 50%.
Yeah. Bilal, let me turn to you. You've followed this very closely from both sides, the American side and the Middle Eastern side. You've written a lot about it, but give me your take on this document. How important is it, and how would you summarize it?
First, can I just say that I've been looking for any excuse to partner with Mike on anything. So the fact that this is happening, it really is a true pleasure.
In this,
Absolutely.
It's a form of entrapment.
Thank you.
I am very much appreciative for your presence, Mike.
Likewise.
Okay. What's new about this? Very little. Although I do agree with Mike that there's a certain determination, a greater emphasis on bureaucratic efficiency. I think that this administration is going to be more serious about cutting the red tape in ways that are a little bit more determined than previous administrations. We've always been very serious about loosening export controls and trying to speed up the release of weapons because even the closest NATO allies have been complaining to us about this notoriously slow and bureaucratic process. But I think this administration is more serious than any about cutting the red tape. Substantively, there's very little that's new. I think I agree with Mike. they have sort of, integrated into a broader national security strategy, and how the arms sales, which are only one part of it, contribute to a number of goals around the region. But what's really new is just this issue of bureaucratic efficiency, and perhaps to be a little bit more specific about loosening the controls on exporting drones.
Before getting to the drones, and I want to ask either you or Michael that this is an administration document.
Yeah.
But for those who follow things from a distance, we often find obviously the U.S. Congress, whether it was going all the way back to the AWACS deals with the Saudis
Right.
in 1981 or whenever it was, to the Egyptian, situation that was problematic in Congress, to the Yemen situation. So how much does this document impact Congress, if
Right.
at all?
So I'll just say a couple of words and I'll turn it over to Mike. So there's a lot of good in the document that, speaks to the balanced nature of it. Like I said, in many ways, not that different from the previous administration's policy. It is quite comprehensive. They almost anticipated all the criticisms at them and trying to preempt them by having language that pretty much covers everything, right? Non-proliferation, human rights, and all that. Very attentive to those things. There's a strong language about each and every
So there
single
is.
issue. Oh,
That's
absolutely.
interesting.
Yes,
On
absolutely.
human rights and
Oh, yeah,
abuse of
absolutely. The
weapons and-
adverse effects of sales on political, economic, social
That's good
issues
to
in the
know.
recipient country. Yes, which is why, like I said, they're trying to anticipate all these criticisms, right? Now, that said, I still have two issues with the document, but I don't think they really have to do with the language itself. It's about optics, or the framing of it, and the emphasis. And it's an age-old problem, number two, which is implementation, right? Which is something that Mike alluded to in the beginning.
Well, you have a piece that came out recently called Trump's New Arms Sales Policy is Good, but Sounds Awful.
Sure, absolutely.
What do you mean by that?
It sounds awful because the framing of it and the emphasis on the economics, right, which is the
Like business.
which is the business, exactly, which is the president's emphasis, makes it sound like all we care about is sell more and sell bigger, which frankly does not reflect
Well, when
reality.
the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was in the White House, President Trump held up
That was embarrassing.
posters of
Yep.
how much each.
So that gives you an example. As a
weapon
matter of
system
fact, that's a great
costs.
example. It gives you an example of what it seems like we care about, even though there is so much more serious work into the policy that's just not reflected publicly.
So bad.
And that's the
bad
administration
marketing.
its own fault.
Michael, Congress, does this constrain Congress? Does it help Congress in certain areas? Does it move the
Congress,
needle?
well, of course, Congress tends to be deferential on these sorts of things to the executive branch. Every so often, historically, as you probably know better than I, there have been exceptions when we wanted to sell certain technologies to the Saudis during the Reagan years, and there was a long process with Congress reminding the president it had statutory power to make this kind of a sale difficult. But often the real tough choices, let me give two examples, the real tough choices are not about the initial approval, but they're about when do you stop a deal when something else happens. So we had the Morsi win and then the coup in Egypt, and the U.S. is providing more than $1 billion a year in total assistance, and there are tank sales and so forth. I heard it described once that the Obama administration, which was in a tough predicament, so I'm sympathetic, but they found a way to get everybody mad at them because they kept making the sales but held up the delivery.
Right.
And so here you had a way where the human
So it
rights
upset
people,
both Congress and the Egyptians.
right, and
Yeah.
both the democracy advocates and the security hardliners, whether in our country or in theirs. And so that's an example where I don't know how the normal congressional review process at the beginning of a sale could have really foreseen where the later difficulty would arise. And another one, which Congress has been at least yelling about lately, is the ongoing provision of advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia in the context of the Yemen war. And Congress wondering if we're facilitating bad warfighting strategy by our partner and whether that should be held up. And then Secretary Mattis coming in and saying, no, please let me continue. I realize they're not doing perfectly, but cutting this off is not going to work well either. And so again, we're well into a conflict. And the question is, how does Congress provide an oversight for a policy that essentially no longer has the power to stop? Now, there may be a point, I'm not familiar with exactly where we stand in the deal with the Saudis on those munitions. There may be a way in which Congress could insert itself in a more formal blocking manner.
Well, let me ask,
but
before
right now
getting
it
into-
hasn't been able to.
Before getting into drones and weapon systems and some details, traditionally it used to be that the big issue was Israel's qualitative military edge, QME. Congress really sort of was very protective of that. That went back to the AWACS sales and others, that Arab countries should not get advanced military equipment. But correct me if I'm wrong, Saudi Arabia now has fighters that even the Israelis or the U.S. doesn't have. My question, I guess, is that congressional and maybe U.S. administration or even Israeli insistence on maintaining a very strong qualitative military edge towards players like Saudi Arabia and others, which are quite close to Israel in terms of their concerns about Iran and others. Has that eroded? Are we in a new reality now, or is that still a very big driving force?
Yeah, I think on high-end combat aircraft, for example, it's hard to say that Israel has a qualitative advantage any longer. They certainly have great pilots and probably better command and control. They're a better Air Force than the Saudis. But I think you're right that concept has shifted and eroded over time. You two know better than I, but my overall sense of why that's happened is, first of all, the rise of Iran. But secondly, the sense that even if Saudi-Israeli relations are still struggling to get towards normalcy, if they ever do, there's less of a fear that the Saudis would attack Israel than there might have been early in the post-1947 era. And so I think the Israelis are willing to tolerate, even if they don't like, this kind of edge, because it helps the Saudis potentially face down Iran, their mutual antagonist.
Right. And that's a big change sort of in the bigger picture.
Right.
Bilal, let's get to not just drones, but what are the weapons that would be of note, of interest, that are new types of weapons that might change considerations or battlefield dynamics? Is drones one of them?
Yeah, but I just want to add a point about QME because, you don't want to exaggerate the reduced significance of the issue in Congress. I think it's still important, but you're absolutely right, Mike. Those new realities of the region, the fact that there is greater, seeing similarly the threat of Iran, those issues are real. And I think, but you also don't want to confuse capability with weapon system. I think there might be less reluctance to sell some Arab countries more high-end weapons, but that doesn't immediately translate into capability, right? They still have to do everything else that comes with, building a capability.
Yeah.
So they can get more hardware than they used to before, but, there's 17 other things that come with hardware, right? So that, in a way, implicitly, the Israelis won't say it, reassures the Israelis, right? On drones, I think we've realized that the issue of drones, in order for us to continue to compete with the Chinese and the Russians, we have to loosen those restrictions.
Say a bit more about that. Why is there competition with the Russians on the Chinese on this issue?
Well, in terms of quality, I think we still are number one. But the fact, it's more about availability. And the fact that they can go to them with fewer constraints about whether it's human rights or any of the other issues that we care about makes it a more likely destination for not just the Arabs, but for others. And that is a certain concern for the administration, obviously. For them to maintain their edge in international defense markets, they have to make their hardware more available to these customers. It's almost like a zero-sum game. If they're not getting it from us, they're getting it from someone else. And that's...
And have there been any significant purchases of Russian or Chinese drones in the Gulf countries or Egypt that you know of?
I can't put a really number on them, but I certainly know that the Emiratis and the Saudis, for sure, have been very much focused on the Chinese market. And they have actually bought some systems from there. And they're also looking at South Africa. And so I see that as a trend, especially if we don't do anything about it. So the fact that we are right now, that might change the balance a little bit.
That's kind of almost a market-driven force that, you want to sell. The U.S. wants to sell stuff. If they don't sell it, somebody else will sell it. It's also a security
it's no secret.
Well.
One of the main architects of the new policy is a trade expert. Peter Navarro is a trade expert, right? I'm not saying that he's not sensitive to the other national security implications of this, but this is in some ways driven by business and also political logic.
So why you say that this new policy, one of the sort of notable things is a loosening on drones? Would that be one of the takeaways?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's
Absolutely,
a simplified.
yes.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, Michael?
From what I understand of the policy, yes.
Yeah. When you look at competition with the Russians and the Chinese and maybe others, beyond drones, the Turks are, buying an S-400. The Saudis in the past, I think, bought a Chinese missile system. And so which areas maybe does the U.S. defense industry feel that they're vulnerable and they have to step up?
In addition to drones, even though I mentioned earlier that I wasn't trying to poo-poo the policy, but I was trying to underscore the limitations of how much it will
is a
change.
technical
term over at Brookings, yeah.
Yes, I see.
Yeah. And I do think that there is some play as to how many fighter jets the Saudis or Emiratis buy from us versus the Europeans. And same kind of choices on chips. So even a 5 or 10% difference could be of interest when the overall incoming is $100 billion. So I think in that regard, there are competitors, there are people that we are trying to maneuver for position against. But again, I think that fundamentally, the Saudis are always going to want to buy a fair amount from us, and they're always going to want to diversify. So those two things will probably limit the spread of possible outcomes.
Right.
Do either you detect any dynamics on the Qatari situation? I mean, on the one hand, Qatar houses the main U.S. base and so on. On the other hand, it's at loggerheads with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are main customers as well. Is Qatar going in any other directions vis-a-vis its arms and defense policy?
It's been challenging to really better understand Qatari national security strategy or defense acquisition strategy. It's been a little bit all over the place with multiple platforms that don't seem to me as interoperable, specifically aircraft. And a lot of it is driven by just the challenges that the Qataris that they've been facing with obviously the crisis with their neighbors. So arms sales policy for them, I don't want to say largely, but partly is a function of developing closer relations with countries who could protect them basically from these new sets of threats that they're facing. So, and this is not really unique to the Qataris. I mean, the challenges of a coherent, more strategic defense acquisition strategies is pretty much shared by all countries in the region, with some exceptions, including the Israelis, right? So it's not just really a Qatari issue. And this is going to be a long process in terms of coming up with, like I said, more coherent, more strategic-driven rationales for which types of systems to acquire and how do they really fit into a broader national defense strategy. Those types of white papers, documents that we do on a regular basis and that Western countries do on a regular basis, those are almost foreign to that part of the world.
I see.
But they're getting it. They understand that it's very critical. And we've been helping as much as possible.
But a long way to go.
But there's a word that has to do with sovereignty. So.
In the time that we have remaining, Michael and Bilal, but let me start with you, Michael. Go back to where you started, sort of, in terms of how does arms sales policy in general fit into not only sort of a national security and strategic vision, but in terms of the difference between building stability, security, peace in a way, versus warmongering. I mean, as you said, on the left, you sell weapons, people get, shot at, and wars occur. The example of NATO, South Korea, and other places that, or even, the Gulf itself, where there's a large U.S. naval presence, it maintains stability and security for decades. So what's your broad view, on not exactly this document, but how do you fit U.S. arms sales policy, particularly towards the Gulf, and the building and preservation of stability rather than, tendencies towards war?
Let me say two things with the Saudis in mind in both. First of all, let's think about missile defense against Iran, and then let's think about being part of this supposed would-be Arab force to replace us in Syria, which has been in discussion lately. Because the first point, some of the technologies the Saudis are buying could help, right? And they are getting better at missile defense. They've shot down some Iranian missiles launched from Yemen at their capital. I don't know how many of the statistics to believe, but I'm confident that at least some headway has been made. And if you really thought that Iran was going to directly unload a barrage from its own territory against the Saudis, it would be good to have some capability in place that we didn't have to pay for, they didn't have to wait for, coming from the United States.
And that's Patriot and THAAD?
Those kinds of systems, and it could go in other directions in the future with standard missiles, shore-based kind of things. But yes, the kinds of stuff you just mentioned. There, I think, even if the Saudi efficiency is only 50%, since they're paying for it, and since 50% could be better than nothing, it's hard to be against it, even though there's a certain amount of cynicism in making the sale, because it's probably not going to ever be used or used well. And I don't think the Iranians are probably going to attack that way. It could be proven wrong. However, where I'm skeptical, and I'll leave it at this, is on this would-be Arab force. I don't see any particular reason to think that all these security engagements and arms sales are going to actually make the Saudis capable of replacing us in Syria. I hope they will be capable.
The problem is they're not willing to start with.
Well, these are the broader
for many
issues.
good reasons.
These are the broader issues. It's political will, it's strategic culture, it's the toughness of their forces on the ground.
Time is a bit tight, but what might we say about you? On Yemen is the gaping wound, sort of. The Gulf, as Gulf is kind of stable and nobody's attacking anybody across the Gulf. Syria has its own mess, and the Gulf is not going to get very involved there. But Yemen is an area where it's come up in the U.S. About the U.S.'s involvement in that. How do you view that situation and the U.S. involvement there?
I think in Yemen, the Saudis have almost taken on an impossible task, certainly for themselves. I don't know how well we would do. We struggle in counterinsurgency or civil war. And Yemen's a pretty big country in terms of population, in terms of the number of actors, even though it's very poor. And so there I think of the problem partly as one of military capability, but more of how do you find a sound strategy?
More the politics.
But in Syria, I question whether they can even find 1,000 people to send in to help us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it returns me to the question of what's the overall net strategic effect of these sales on their inherent strength as a military organization. And there I have to conclude with a little bit of skepticism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. Bilal, the last word is yours. Any concluding remarks that you want to add before we wrap this up?
No, maybe just comment on the question that you raised about, how do arms sales, or if they actually contribute to, stability and peace.
Or not, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I just want to be on the record to say that, contrary to a lot of the conventional wisdom raised by, the arms controllers, by the way, I'm a huge arms controller myself, but the most pragmatic way, the Schellingian way. I don't buy the argument that arms sales per se fuel conflicts or lead to arms races. There's just an extensive body of scholarship that disproves that. But that doesn't mean I'm totally in favor, and I'm relating it back to the document, of selling more in order to generate more economic profit. That shouldn't be the driver of our arms sales policy.
Mm-hmm.
The Reagan administration believed that more was better, but at least they had a strategic argument, which is to fight global communism and to equip our partners. The strategic logic here is a little bit missing.
Shaky.
Right.
Yeah.
And so not only do I not want us to sell more to generate economic revenue, but I don't even want it to be perceived as us selling more to generate economic profit, because it's just an unnecessary battle that we'd be fighting, not only with Congress, because, by the way, if you've checked the news lately, all sorts of problems we've gotten ourselves into by transferring weapons to partners in Syria and Iraq, and the disaster that's contributed to in Yemen, but with many other international stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
So that overemphasis on economics, in my opinion, is unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you both for being with us today. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Foreign Policy at our brotherly think tank neighbor across the street, the Brookings Institution. Thank you, Michael, for being with us today and being at MEI.
My pleasure, Paul.
Bilal, our Senior Fellow and Director of Defense and Security here at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mike.
And our audience, thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you have comments, put them on our Facebook page. Otherwise, tune in next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.